So this video is going to be lots of different situations where they're going to ask you to find the linear equation. And linear, notice the root word of linear is line, L-I-N-E. Linear equation, it means an equation that forms a line. And as you've been learning through this section on graphing, we can find sets of coordinates, which we call the x and y coordinates, and we can put them on the graph and then connect the dots and form a line. Well, sometimes they don't give us the equation, they actually just give us the line. And they can point out some places on the line that they want us to use, or they could just give us a line and we find some points on that line that we want to use. So in this case, we have a line drawn on a graph, and there's two locations that have been identified that we should use because they gave us those locations. But if they didn't give us those, then we could choose any spot we wanted to as long as it was on the line. But the steps I'm going to use in all the situations that we have here, this first one, it gives us a graph. And the next one is just going to give us two sets of coordinates. And the next one, it's going to give us the slope and a set of coordinates. And then the last one's going to give us the slope and another particular set of coordinates. But in all of those situations, we're going to use the same three steps. We're going to, number one, make sure that we find the slope of the equation, of the line. And we do that using the slope formula. We call that y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, about how to be careful with that and how to put the numbers into it and that sort of thing. Then once we find the slope, which we refer to as the letter M, and I always like to know why they call it what they do. Well, I've searched high and low, can't figure out why they chose the letter M for slope, so I made up my own idea to get my brain to accept it, and that is, where do you go skiing in the slopes? But the mountains. M for mountain, slopes are in the mountain kind of thing. That's my brain. Number two, step two is once you've found the slope, then you can then find the y-intercept, which is the letter B in the equation that we're trying to form. Because notice we're trying to form the equation y equals mx plus b. That's the template for it, meaning we're going to have an equation that looks like, for example, y equals 2x plus 4, or y equals negative 1/3 x plus 7, or y equals 5/3 x minus 2. So in all of these cases, these are all linear equations, and notice that next to the x value, there's a number sitting there, and that means that that's the slope. That tells how steep the line is. And then the number that's hanging on the end, the b value, that's the y-intercept, where this line would touch the y-axis. So that's what we call the y-intercept. So step one, we're going to find the slope, and step two, we're going to find the y-intercept, because once we have those two things, then we can create the equation. The equation will only show those two things, and then the x and the y will just stay plain x and y. So let's go over here to this situation that we started with. Step one was to find the slope. And to find the slope, we need two sets of coordinates. So we are going to find on the line the two sets of coordinates, the address of those that they gave us. Now this one right here, remember you go left to right first, so I would have to go from the 0 over to the 1 because this is lined up. It's like you can kind of, you say, well, how does the y and the x affect this dot? Well, this is lined up with the 1 on the x, so 1 on the x, and then it's at the negative 3 on the y. This one up here, it's 3 on the x and up to 2 on the y. So 3 on the x and positive 2 on the y. Now, it didn't matter. I could have found this one first and then this one. It doesn't matter which one we do first or second. To use the slope formula, we have to say, you know, the second y minus the first y over the second x minus the first x. And so when these numbers are written down low, they're called subscript. That means they're telling you the position. So this set could be our first set, and that would make this one our second set. Or we could do it the other way around. It's going to be fine either way. So we could call this our second set, and this our first set. Either way is fine. The main issue we have to be careful about is that whatever you start with on the top needs to come from the same set as what you start with on the bottom. So like if I started with the y in this one and put 2 here, then make sure underneath it I put the x from that same set. So it doesn't matter which set you start with, just make sure they're from the same set when you start. So I'm going to set this up. I'm going to make this my first set and this my second set. And I do like to write those things up above it because I think that this formula can get confusing with the little 1s and 2s and so forth. So I don't trust my brain to transfer things correctly. So I do mark them on what I've decided they'll be. Then the next thing I do, this is important, especially when you're working with negative numbers. It can kind of mess things up if we're not careful. So what I do is I first draw the fraction line and I put in the subtraction parts of the equation, like this. And then I also make space for the numbers that I'm going to plug in. I put parentheses around it because I don't want to confuse that subtraction symbol with the negative that might be on a number that I'm working with. I want to see that they're separate because sometimes that's where people make mistakes. In fact, it's probably the most common mistake people make when finding slope. All right, so now I have it set up now with just the basic pattern here. And now I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say, okay, my y2. So I made this my y2, so that's 2 minus my other y, which is -3. And then my first y, excuse me, not first y, my second x, so it's 3 here. So notice both of these numbers are lined up here, minus my first x. And I'll tell you, having the y's on top and the x's on the bottom, my brain doesn't like it because there's everything else I seem to do in math seems to be in alphabetical order. And this seems upside down to almost all of our brains. You know, even the coordinates have the x first and then the y. But here in slope, we don't. And so again, that's why it's so important to take your time when you're setting this equation up so that you don't get them upside down and that sort of thing. So now if you put this in your calculator, 2 minus a -3, you're going to end up with a +5. And then 3 minus 1 is 2. So we now know that that's our slope. Our slope is 5/2. That was step 1, find your slope. Now, that makes sense. It's a +5/2. And the reason it makes sense to me is this is starting low and it's going high. It's going uphill. And I know any slope that is starting low and going high is a positive slope. If the line had been going downhill like this, I would expect my answer to be a negative answer. Okay, so that so far meets with what my expectation was. Now I need to find the b value, the y-intercept. And I'm going to do that by plugging in one set of x and y that I know for sure, and I'm going to plug in my slope into the equation. So I'm starting with the y equals mx plus b. I now know my slope is 5/2. And I can choose either one of these sets. It doesn't matter which one. It's going to come up with the same answer either way. So I like to use the one that has all positive numbers in it just because it's easier. So I'll put the 2 in for the y and the 3 in for the x. So 2 for y, 3 for x. And this is going to allow me to have an equation where the only letter I don't know is the b. I'm trying to solve for b. So now when I do the math, I get 2 is equal to 15 over 2 plus b. And then I'm going to subtract 15 over 2 from both sides because I'm trying to solve for b. So it's going to be 2 minus 15 over 2. And that's going to tell me that it's a negative 11 over 2. So negative 11 over 2 is b. My b value now is negative 11 over 2. So I found my b value. I know now that my slope is 5 over 2, and I know my b value is negative 11 over 2. And since I know these now, I can now build the equation that I'm looking for, replacing the m with my slope and the b with the intercept value. And so I have y equals 5/2 x. So the x and y stay the same. We only put numbers in them over here so we could solve for b. But now we go back to just being regular x and y. And then since this is a negative 11 over 2, then this whole thing becomes negative 11 over 2. So this is the equation for the line that was created here. Now, go to the next one. We're going to do the same 3 steps. We're going to find the slope. We're going to find the b value. Then we're going to plug it all into y equals mx plus b. So my slope, and again, boy, this one's a real mess with all the negatives. So again, be super careful finding that slope. Those parentheses, setting it up this way could really save you on this one. Okay, so I'm going to call this my x1 and my y1. So that makes this my x2 and my y2. All right, so y2 minus y1 and x2 minus x1. So that's my setup. Bless your brain by using your calculator, because doing all these negatives, our brains do not like. Our brains don't look at this and go -1 minus a -2. It doesn't make sense to our brain that this answer is actually a +1. It doesn't seem right to our brain. So use your calculator so your brain doesn't have to do the work and mess it up. And then 1 minus a -3 is actually a +4. So now we know that the slope is 1/4. All right, so our slope is 1/4. Now we need to know the b value. So we're going to use the y equals mx plus b. We're going to put that slope in there that was 1/4. And then we can use either one of these sets. Now, this one has a negative in it. These are both negatives. So this one looks a little bit easier to use, in addition to the fact that it has ones in it. Math with ones is so much easier. So that's why I would choose this one. But you can use the other one. It's still going to work either way. So if I put -1 in for y, and then I put +1 in for x, now I can solve for b to find out what that value is. So -1 is equal to 1/4 times 1, which is still just 1/4, because anything times 1 is itself. Okay. And then to get b alone, I'm going to subtract 1/4 from both sides. And if you can put that in your calculator, I'd recommend that. That way you don't have to worry about finding the common denominators and all that kind of stuff. So -1 minus 1/4 is -5/4. That's our b value. So now we know this one is -5/4. So now we have the information we need for our equation. So y equals the slope of 1/4 x and a -5/4. There's the equation of that line. Here, they have the same steps. Step 1, find the slope. But they gave us the slope. They're saying the slope is negative 2/3. So, okay, we don't have to do any work for that one. Sometimes they do some of the work for you. Step 2 is we need to know the y-intercept. And I will tell you that the y-intercept, if you know it, if it's given to you in a set of coordinates, it's going to look like 0. And then the y-intercept number will be here. We looked at that when we were in another video when we were graphing and using the slope and the y-intercept to graph, that every time you have the y-intercept, the x value is 0. So I don't have it here. I don't see the y-intercept here. So I'm going to go to step B, where I'm going to plug in to the equation this set of coordinates. Here's my x and my y. So y equals negative 2/3 times 3 plus b. So I can solve for b. So 6 equals negative 2, because when you multiply these, it equals negative 2 plus b. And so then I'm going to add 2 to both sides to get b alone. There it is. B is 8. So now I'm ready to find the answer. It's y equals negative 2/3 x and a positive 8. So we're going to do plus 8. There it is. That was the equation. And then lastly, here, they just give us the slope and they gave us the y-intercept, and we know that because your x is 0. So this has to be the y-intercept. It's saying this line crosses the y-axis at negative 2. So we know the slope, that's done. And we know the y-intercept, that's done. And so now we can just plug it into y equals mx plus b. It's going to say y equals 4x minus 2. That's it. Now, if you didn't notice that this was the y-intercept, you could have still just tried to find it like we did up above, where we just plug it in and put, okay, y is negative 2, slope is 4, x is 0, and then we want to solve for b, just like we did on the last 3 problems. And so then we'd say negative 2 equals 0 plus b, which is just b, right? So there it is. There's your y-intercept.